In the year 2397, humanity had finally achieved its place in the stars. The United Terran Federation had become a respected member of the Galactic Assembly, a group of advanced civilizations that governed the galaxy. However, despite humanity's achievements, many of the other races considered them to be a relatively young species, too impulsive, too unpredictable, and too idealistic to truly understand the ways of the galaxy. It was a typical session of the Galactic Assembly when the distress signal from Scifi 9 arrived. The planet, located in a distant star system, was home to an intelligent species known as the Anorans. They had a peaceful society, focused on science and art, but their world was dying. The star at the center of their system was collapsing, a cataclysmic event that would consume their planet within a matter of weeks. Desperate for help, the Anorans sent out a message, hoping that someone, anyone, would answer. But when the message reached the assembly, the response was not what they had hoped for. The council chamber, a massive hall filled with representatives from dozens of advanced species, buzzed with conversation. Captain Elena Marquez, humanity's representative, watched intently from her seat. Her people had come a long way, but their presence in the assembly was still seen as a novelty by many of the older, more established species. The Anorans' plea was heartbreaking, but the reactions from the other members were cold and practical. An alien delegate, tall and cloaked in shimmering silver robes, stood and spoke first. His voice echoed throughout the hall. "The Anorans are a primitive species," he said, his tone dismissive. "Their planet is of no strategic value. The collapse of their star is an unfortunate event, but it is not our responsibility to intervene. We cannot waste resources on a lost cause." Another delegate, this one from a race of towering insectoid beings, clicked his mandibles in agreement. "We've already sent assistance to countless worlds. The Anorans have had ample time to prepare, but they've chosen not to advance. It's their own fault." The room was filled with murmurs of agreement. The Anorans were a fragile species, their technology rudimentary compared to the advanced civilizations of the assembly. Their sun was collapsing, and there was no time to evacuate their entire population. Yet, despite the grave circumstances, the decision was being made. No help would be given. Captain Marquez's heart sank as she listened to the cold logic of the assembly members. The Anorans were being condemned, not because they deserved it, but because their plight wasn't deemed worthy of attention. She knew this was the way of the galaxy, survival of the fittest, the strongest winning, and the weak being left to perish. But humanity wasn't like the others. Rising from her seat, Captain Marquez's voice rang out across the hall. "I disagree," she said, her words cutting through the air with confidence. "Humanity will help the Anorans. We will not stand by while a species is wiped out." There was a stunned silence. Representatives from every species turned to look at her, some in disbelief, others in outright scorn. The Anorans, who had been watching the assembly's proceedings with hopeful eyes, were now staring in shock. No one had expected such a bold declaration. "You?" A representative from the Aquarians, a race of aquatic beings with smooth, glassy skin, snorted. "Your species is young. You are not equipped for such a mission. The Anorans' plight is beyond what you can manage." Marx met their gaze with unwavering resolve. "Humanity may be young, but we have a history of stepping up when others won't. If no one else will save the Anorans, then we will. We'll find a way to evacuate their people and help them rebuild. They may not be the strongest, but that's exactly why they deserve our help." The other delegates were unmoved. "This is not a matter for idealism," the silver-robed delegate said. "The resources required to save the Anorans are immense. Your people are not prepared for the sacrifices this mission will require." "I don't care," Marx replied. "The mission is not about resources. It's about doing what's right." The assembly members exchanged glances, some shaking their heads in disbelief. "You are free to waste your resources on this mission," the insectoid delegate said, his voice dripping with disdain. "But don't expect any assistance from us." With that, the debate was closed. The assembly voted, and the decision was clear. Humanity would be alone in its mission to save the Anorans. But Marquez felt a sense of purpose deep in her bones. The other civilizations might turn away, but humanity would not. As she left the assembly chamber, she looked out at the stars, where the fate of the Anorans awaited. She knew the road ahead would be difficult, perhaps even impossible. But one thing was certain: humanity would not stand idle while another species was left to die. It was their choice to make, and they had chosen to fight for life, no matter the odds. Captain Elena Marquez sat in her office aboard the Resolute Endeavor, staring out at the stars. The meeting in the Galactic Assembly had been both a victory and a heavy burden. She had managed to secure humanity's commitment to the mission, but the weight of the responsibility felt overwhelming. The Anorans were counting on her on Earth, on humanity as a whole, to fulfill a promise that the galaxy had turned its back on. Behind her, the door opened, and Commander Jason Harper, her second-in-command, stepped into the room. His usual confident demeanor was replaced by a look of concern. "Elena, you know what you're about to do isn't going to be easy," he said, his voice low. "I know," she replied, not turning around. "But it's the right thing to do. The Anorans don't deserve to die, because they were too slow to advance technologically. If we can save them, we will." Harper sighed. "The Assembly doesn't think so. They won't support us, and they've already warned us that interference with Seravan 9's collapse could cause more harm than good." "I don't care about their warnings," Mark said firmly. "We've already made our decision, and now we have to follow through." The two of them stood there in silence for a moment, the weight of their mission settling between them. Harper finally spoke again. "How are we going to pull this off? The Anorans have no way to escape their planet, and we're not exactly prepared for a mass evacuation. We barely have the technology for deep space operations, let alone an emergency rescue of this scale." "We'll figure it out," Marcus said, turning to face him with a determined look. "We've got engineers, scientists, and a fleet of ships ready to go. We might be new to space, but we're resourceful, and we don't give up." "All right," Harper said with a nod, "but we'll need help, and not just from the Federation. This is a massive undertaking. We can't do it alone." Marquez thought for a moment. She knew he was right. While humanity had the will and the drive to help, their technology was still in its early stages compared to the galactic powers that dominated the Assembly. To make this mission a success, they would need more than just their own ships and engineers. They would need resources that were beyond what Earth could provide alone. "We can't rely on the Assembly," Marcus said, "but we can ask for help from our allies. We've made some friends among the lesser-known species. There are races out there who believe in helping others, just like we do." Harper raised an eyebrow. "You're thinking of the Valrathi, aren't you?" Marquez smiled slightly. The Valrathi were a small nomadic species known for their advanced energy technology. They had been one of the few races to support humanity in the past, and though their numbers were small, they had great knowledge in resource management. "The Valrathi have the energy shields we need to protect the evacuation ships from solar flares," Marcus said. "And the Grellians have the medical technology to handle mass casualty situations if it comes to that. We'll need all the help we can get." "Then it's settled," Harper said. "We start contacting our allies. We'll need them to help us gather the necessary resources for this mission." Within the next few hours, Marquez and Harper had sent out communications to the Valrathi and the Grellians, requesting their assistance in the rescue mission. Meanwhile, the engineers aboard the Resolute Endeavor worked tirelessly, developing an emergency evacuation plan. The crew had already begun the process of designing high-capacity transports that could carry the Anoran people away from their dying world. But time was running out, and the window for safe evacuation was closing quickly. As the days passed, more and more ships joined the fleet. The Valrathi arrived with their advanced energy shields, capable of withstanding the intense heat from the collapsing sun. The Grellians provided medical equipment, including state-of-the-art cryo chambers that could preserve the Anorans in case they needed to be treated for injuries during the evacuation. The Federation supplied military-grade transports, and human engineers worked around the clock to retrofit the ships for the mission. But not everyone was on board with the plan. As the fleet began to assemble, whispers of doubt circulated among the crew. Some wondered whether humanity was truly prepared for such a dangerous mission. Others questioned whether saving the Anorans was worth the immense risk they were about to take. Marquez heard the concerns but refused to let them shake her resolve. She had seen the best of humanity during her time in the Federation. She knew that despite their inexperience, humans had a unique ability to adapt and innovate. They would find a way to make this work. One evening, as the fleet prepared to depart, Marquez stood at the observation deck of the Resolute Endeavor, looking out at the stars. The vast emptiness of space stretched before her, and the enormity of the task ahead settled in her mind. It wasn't just about saving the Anorans anymore. It was about proving that humanity had a place in the galaxy, not just as conquerors, but as protectors. As she gazed into the void, Marquez felt the weight of the galaxy pressing down on her shoulders. But she was not afraid. "We can do this," she whispered to herself. And with that, the fleet set its course for Scifi 9. The fleet of ships, now a coalition of various species united by a shared purpose, sped through space toward Scifi 9. Captain Alina Marquez stood at the helm of the Resolute Endeavor, her eyes focused on the data streams coming from the ship's navigation system. The stars outside were nothing more than streaks of light as they passed at incredible speeds, but each moment felt like a countdown to something crucial. The fate of the Anorans rested on their shoulders, and time was not their ally. "We're entering the Scifi system," announced Commander Jason Harper, his voice steady. "We'll be in range of the planet in 3 hours. We need to make sure all systems are ready for immediate deployment." Marquez nodded, her mind racing. The Anoran sun was rapidly collapsing, and the planet was already beginning to show signs of environmental instability. The skies were growing darker, and earthquakes and violent storms had begun to plague the surface. The collapse of Scifi 9's star would soon send a massive shockwave that would tear apart everything in its path. Every minute they spent traveling now was one less minute to save the planet's population. As the fleet neared the system, the fleet's engineers, working across multiple ships, began the final preparations. Hundreds of transport ships, each designed to carry hundreds of Anorans, were being loaded with supplies. Evacuation protocols were set in motion, with the military-grade ships ready to protect the transports from the dangers outside the planet's atmosphere. "We've got one shot at this," Marquez muttered under her breath. "There's no room for failure." The communication link to the Anorans was open, and the voice of their leader, Ralnath, echoed through the ship's speakers. He was a short, delicate-looking species, his blue skin almost glowing against the dimming light of his planet. His voice was filled with a mix of hope and disbelief. "Captain Marquez, you came," Ralnath said, his voice cracking slightly. We didn't believe you would. We thought you were like the others, all words and no action. But now we see you are truly here. We don't have much time. The sky is changing. Our homes are falling apart." "I know," Marquez said, trying to steady her emotions. "We'll get you out, I promise you. But you need to be ready. We're going to begin the evacuation immediately." Ralnath's voice quivered with fear, but he responded with determination. "Our people are scattered. Some are still in the cities, others in the wilderness. We will need every transport you have to save them all." Marquez turned to Harper, who was now standing beside her. His expression was grim. "We're going to need more time than we have," he said. "The planet's atmosphere is becoming unstable. Once we begin evacuation, the transports will be at risk from solar flares and gravitational anomalies." "I don't care," Marquez said firmly. "We've come this far. We'll make it work." The ships in the fleet were designed for different purposes. Some had been repurposed for this mission, while others were brand new, designed specifically for rapid evacuation. The largest transport ships were loaded with the most vulnerable members of the Anoran society: the elderly, the sick, and the children. Smaller, faster ships were used to transport those who could make it to the landing zones in time. The Valrathi, with their advanced energy shields, took the lead in escorting the convoy, ensuring that the transports were protected from any external dangers. As the first wave of transports began to descend toward Scifi 9, the planet's atmosphere seemed to fight back. Solar flares erupted from the dying star, and violent winds tore through the ships. The gravitational pull from the collapsing sun grew stronger, making it nearly impossible for the ships to maintain their course. The engineers aboard the Resolute Endeavor worked quickly to stabilize the trajectory of the transports, but the strain on the fleet was becoming more evident by the second. "We've got a problem," Harper said urgently. "One of the transport ships in the second wave has been hit by a flare. Its shields are failing. They won't make it through the atmosphere at this rate." Marquez's eyes widened in concern. "Can you stabilize it?" Harper typed furiously at his console. "I'm doing everything I can. The energy shields are weak, and the gravity wells are pulling the ship off course. We may lose them if we don't act quickly." With no time to waste, Marquez made a snap decision. "Send out a team. I'll take command of the Resolute Endeavor and go after that transport. We're not losing anyone." She grabbed her helmet and raced to the bridge. As she prepared to take command of the Resolute Endeavor, Harper gave her a quick but serious look. "Be careful, Alina," he said. "We can't afford any more risks." "I know," she replied, her voice filled with determination. "We save them all, or we don't stop trying." The Resolute Endeavor broke away from the fleet, its engines roaring as it sped toward the troubled transport. Marquez's hands tightened around the controls as the planet's atmosphere churned with danger. Solar flares erupted in waves, and the gravitational anomalies made it feel like the ship was being pulled in all directions. The transport ship was wobbling in the sky, barely able to hold itself together. Marquez saw the crew aboard the vessel, Anoran and human engineers working together to maintain control. Sweat streamed down their faces as they fought against the massive forces trying to tear their ship apart. Marquez focused, ignoring the chaos around her. She knew that every second mattered. The fate of the Anorans depended on her. "We've got this," she whispered to herself as she approached the transport, ready to do whatever it took to bring it safely to the evacuation zone. As the Resolute Endeavor glided through the turbulent atmosphere of Scifi 9, Captain Alina Marquez could feel the weight of the mission pressing down on her. The dying star overhead sent waves of intense radiation, and the planet below seemed to be buckling under the strain of its impending destruction. But there was no turning back now. The Anorans had placed their trust in humanity, and Marquez was determined not to let them down. Her ship was part of the first wave of human vessels to land on the planet's surface. As they touched down on the charred, cracked ground, Marquez saw the Anorans waiting in the distance, their frail forms standing against the harsh wind that whipped through the landscape. Their once beautiful cities had been reduced to rubble by the planet's earthquakes, and the air was thick with dust and smoke. It was a stark contrast to the peaceful, advanced world they had once known. Ralnoth, the leader of the Anorans, was one of the first to greet them. His appearance was striking. A small, thin figure with pale blue skin, his face drawn with lines of worry, but also hope. His eyes widened as he saw the human fleet arrive, his voice shaking as he approached. You came," Ralnoth said, his voice filled with disbelief. We didn't think it was possible. But you're here. You're really here." Marquez stepped forward, extending her hand in greeting. "We promised we would help, and humanity always keeps its promises. We'll get your people to safety." Ralnoth looked around at the fleet and the transports lined up behind Marquez. His expression was a mix of awe and confusion. "But how? We've heard the stories. The galaxy is full of powerful species who turn away from the weak. They said it was too late, that we were doomed." Marquez looked into Ralnoth's eyes, her voice soft but firm. "Some might say that, but humanity doesn't turn its back on others. We believe in helping, no matter how difficult the task." Ralnath seemed to absorb her words, his gaze drifting over the transports and engineers that were already beginning to work. You really mean it. You've come to save us. Marquez nodded. Yes, we've come for you. Your people don't deserve to perish because of what's happening to your star. We'll get you to safety. The first few transports began to open their doors, and the Anorans cautiously approached. Marquez could see the mixture of fear and hope in their eyes. These people had lived through earthquakes, storms, and a collapsing planet. Yet now they were unsure whether to trust the strangers who had come to save them. Some Anorans hesitated, unsure if this would be their salvation or yet another disappointment. One by one, Anorans boarded the ships, led by their families. The younger members of the species moved quickly, eager to escape the death trap that their homeworld had become. But the older Anorans, many of whom had lived through peaceful generations, moved slowly, eyes filled with uncertainty. Captain Marquez turned to her crew, her voice steady. We'll need to make sure the evacuation goes smoothly. There are still many on the surface, and we can't afford to lose anyone. I want every transport loaded and ready within the hour. She spoke with authority, and the crew responded immediately. Engineers and military personnel moved quickly to load supplies and escort the Anorans aboard. But despite the urgency, Marquez couldn't help but notice how fragile the situation seemed. Each moment felt like it could fall apart, and the harsh winds of Seravan 9 didn't help. As the evacuation continued, a sudden rumble beneath the ground shook the transports. Marquez grabbed the nearest rail, her heart racing. Another earthquake had struck the surface, this one stronger than the last. The planet's core was beginning to destabilize more rapidly. Captain, Harper's voice came through the comms. We've got a situation. There's a massive fault line opening up just outside the main evacuation area. It's moving fast. We need to get the transports out of there immediately, or we'll be trapped. Marquez's stomach dropped. The already dangerous mission had just become far more complicated. Understood. Tell the ships to launch immediately. I want all remaining transports off the ground right now. Understood, Captain. Launching now, Harper replied. Marquez's eyes darted to the Anorans, who were still boarding the transports. She saw the panic in their faces as the ground shook again. Some of them hesitated, unsure whether it was safe to board. Marquez knew they needed to be calm, but the urgency of the situation made it hard to keep everyone calm. We don't have time, Marquez shouted. Get on the transports now. This is your chance to survive. Ralnath, his voice cracking, stepped forward and raised his hands to the crowd. Please, everyone, we must trust them. This is our only hope. His words seemed to calm the Anorans, and they began to board the ships more quickly. The transports began to lift off, one by one, breaking free from the dying planet's gravity. But as they did, another violent tremor rocked the surface, and a massive rift opened up just a few miles from their position. The ground beneath their feet seemed to tear itself apart. Marquez's heart raced as she watched the last transports take off. The resolute Endeavor was still on the ground, the last of the human ships preparing for departure. The Anorans were safe for now, but their journey was far from over. She looked out at the wreckage of Seravan 9 one last time. The planet was crumbling, but humanity had done what it could to save them. As the fleet ascended into the stars, Marquez felt a sense of pride. They had kept their promise. But as they left the dying world behind, she knew the challenges were far from over. The galaxy had turned its back on the Anorans, but humanity had chosen to stand with them. And that, she realized, was just the beginning. The resolute Endeavor and the fleet of transports sailed through the vastness of space, carrying the last remnants of Seravan 9's population. Captain Elena Marquez stood at the bridge, her gaze fixed on the stars ahead. The evacuation had been a success, at least for now. The Anorans were safe, but their journey was far from over. They had no home to return to, no planet to rebuild. Humanity's promise to save them had been fulfilled, but the true test had only just begun. Captain, "We've got a problem." Commander Harper's voice broke through her thoughts, his tone grave. "What's wrong?" Marcus turned to face him, concern knitting her brows. "The fleet's engines are starting to show signs of strain," Harper explained. "The radiation from the collapsing star at Scifi 9 has damaged some of the shielding on the transports. If we don't find a safe place to repair them, we might lose the entire fleet." Marquez's heart sank. "How bad is it?" "It's manageable, but we need to act fast. We can't afford to wait too long. We're already pushing the limits of our supplies," Harper said. "We'll need to find a station or a nearby planet with the resources to make quick repairs." Marquez nodded, her mind racing. The Anorans, still shaken by the destruction of their homeworld, were now depending on humanity not just for rescue, but for a future. They needed a safe place to stay, a place where they could rebuild, even if it was just a temporary refuge. "We'll find somewhere," Marcus said with determination. "Send out a signal. Let's see if we can get in touch with any nearby stations." Harper worked quickly, sending a distress signal through the fleet's communication channels. The Resolute Endeavor wasn't the only ship capable of making repairs, but it was the largest and most advanced vessel in the fleet. Marquez hoped that somewhere there was a friendly station that could assist them. Hours passed, and the silence of space hung heavy around them. The Anorans, still adjusting to their new reality, kept to themselves. Some were lost in grief over the destruction of their world, while others tried to comfort their families. The human crew worked tirelessly, ensuring the ships were still functioning and preparing for what would come next. Suddenly, a signal came through. "This is Station Epsilon 7. We received your distress signal. You are cleared for docking," came a voice through the comms. "But you'll need to hurry. We can only offer limited resources for repairs." "Understood," Marcus said, relief flooding through her. "Prepare the fleet for docking. Let's move quickly." Within the hour, the fleet had reached Station Epsilon 7, a small mining outpost on the edge of a distant star system. It wasn't much, a gray industrial station that orbited a barren planet, but it was their best option. The docking ports opened, and the ships in the fleet slowly moved into the station's hangars, one by one. The station's crew, a mixture of humans and a few other species, scrambled to assist with the repairs. The Anorans, still uneasy from their long journey, were escorted to temporary shelters on the station while the repairs were underway. Captain Marquez watched as the fleet was repaired, her thoughts lingering on the Anorans. They were a peaceful people, once thriving in a vibrant civilization, now scattered across a fleet of ships with no place to call home. Marquez couldn't help but wonder where they would go next. Scifi 9 was gone, and the galaxy was vast and cold. Where would they find a new world to settle? As if reading her mind, Harper approached her, a concerned look on his face. "We've got a situation, Captain. The Anorans are asking about their future. They're scared. They don't know where they're going, or if they even have a future anymore." Marcus sighed, her shoulders heavy. "I know. I've seen the fear in their eyes. They thought they had no hope left after the collapse of their planet. We promised them safety, but we can't just give them a place to stay. They need a future." Harper nodded. "We can't offer them a permanent home here. This station is barely enough to support us, let alone an entire population. We'll need to find a planet for them, something habitable." Marquez's eyes narrowed as she thought about the options. The Federation, while supportive of the rescue effort, had made it clear that they would not offer permanent sanctuary to the Anorans. The resources needed to resettle an entire species on a new world would be immense, and the Federation's policy was one of neutrality, helping, but not committing to any one race for the long term. "We'll find them a planet," Marcus said, determination back in her voice. "Humanity didn't promise them just a safe place to stay for now. We promised them a future. We'll find a world they can call their own." Harper studied her for a moment before nodding. "I'll help you make that happen." Days passed, and the repairs to the fleet were completed. The Anorans, though still grieving their loss, seemed to regain a small spark of hope. Marcus knew that hope was fragile, and it would take more than just a promise to restore the trust they had placed in humanity. One evening, as the station's engineers completed the final checks on the transports, Marcus stood on the station's observation deck, gazing out into the endless expanse of space. The stars seemed so distant, and the future seemed uncertain, but she was resolute. Humanity had taken the first step by helping the Anorans, but now they had to help them rebuild their lives on a new world, far from the destruction of Scifi 9. "We will find you a place to call home," she whispered to the empty expanse. And with that, she turned away from the stars, ready to continue the mission. The fleet had spent weeks in the small mining station, Station Epsilon 7, undergoing repairs and restocking supplies. While the ships were now operational, Captain Elena Marquez knew that the hardest part was still ahead, finding a new home for the Anorans. The once proud species had lost their planet, and now they were scattered across a fleet of ships with no destination in sight. As the planet Vera grew larger on the view screen, Marquez stood at the front of the bridge, her heart filled with a renewed sense of hope. The journey was far from over, but the future, at last, seemed bright. The planet Vera loomed ahead, its blue and green surface sparkling like a beacon in the cold darkness of space. As Captain Elena Marquez stood on the bridge of the resolute Endeavor, her heart pounded with anticipation. This was it, the moment they had all been working for. After weeks of searching, of uncertainty and desperation, they had found a new home for the Anorans. But even as the excitement spread among the crew and the Anorans, Marquez knew that this was just the beginning. Vera may have been a promising world, but they had no idea what challenges it would present. The planet's atmosphere was breathable, its gravity similar to Scifi 9, and it had fertile land. But they hadn't yet explored its full potential. There were no guarantees. "Captain, we're nearing orbit." Lieutenant Rosa DeLuca's voice broke through her thoughts. "Ready to begin our scans." Marquez nodded. "Proceed with caution. We don't know what's waiting for us down there." As the fleet descended toward Vera, the first wave of scouts and engineers prepped to land. The Anorans, who had remained in the fleet's transports until now, stood by anxiously. Many were still hesitant, not fully trusting that the planet would offer them the safety they longed for. They had seen their world fall apart before. It was hard to believe that this new world would be different. Ralnoth, the leader of the Anorans, stood by Marquez's side as they watched the planet grow larger on the view screen. His eyes were filled with uncertainty, but there was a glimmer of hope there too. "Captain, do you think we can really rebuild here?" Marquez looked at him, her expression softening. "I believe so. This world may be untamed, but it offers the chance to start again. A chance to build a future for your people." Ralnoth nodded, though his face remained anxious. "We've lost everything. But if there's hope here, we will try." The landing shuttles broke away from the fleet, descending toward the surface of Vera. The planet was as beautiful as it was mysterious. Vast forests stretched across the horizon, while mountain ranges rose high above, their snow-capped peaks touching the clouds. Rivers and lakes glistened in the sunlight. It was a world brimming with potential, yet untapped and raw. As the first shuttle landed, Marquez watched through the window as the team of explorers began to disembark. The air was fresh, and the soil rich with promise. A large group of Anorans watched from the ships, some of them eager to step onto the new world, while others remained hesitant. "Let's move, people," Marquez ordered, her voice firm. "We're not going to stand around. We're here to build a new home, not just dream about it." The humans and Anorans worked together, beginning the careful process of setting up temporary shelters and establishing a base camp. The engineers worked on setting up communication towers, while the medics checked the local flora and fauna for any possible dangers. It was a slow and steady process, but it was progress. Ralnoth stood with Marquez as they surveyed the land from a small rise. He seemed lost in thought, watching as his people began to adapt to their new surroundings. The initial shock of landing on a new planet was wearing off, and the Anorans were beginning to show signs of hope once again. "Thank you, Captain," Relnoth said quietly, "for giving us a chance." Marquez smiled softly. "This is just the beginning. The real work starts now." Over the next few weeks, the work on Vera intensified. The Anorans had already begun cultivating small plots of land, planting crops that would help sustain them as they began to settle. The humans worked alongside them, teaching them how to use the equipment, how to adapt to the planet's natural environment. There were challenges, unexpected storms, strange wildlife, and the unpredictable terrain. But the Anorans were resilient. Marquez spent her days overseeing the efforts, her mind constantly turning over the next steps. It was clear that this was no easy task. Vera may have been a hopeful world, but it was still wild and untamed. There were dangers they had yet to fully understand, and the task of creating a sustainable future would require all their strength and ingenuity. One evening, as Marquez walked through the camp, she found Relnoth standing by a small group of Anorans, watching the sunset. The sky was streaked with vibrant colors, and the planet's 2 moons began to rise on the horizon. The sight was breathtaking, and for a moment, Marquez felt the weight of everything that had brought them here. "The Anorans are calling this place home," Relnoth said quietly, almost to himself. "It feels like we've been given another chance." Marquez nodded, her voice steady. "You have been, and we'll make sure that this time you don't lose it." As the sun set on Vera, the first stars began to twinkle in the night sky. The journey was far from over. There would be struggles ahead. There always were, but humanity and the Anorans had done what so many others would not. They had chosen to stand together, to give each other hope when the universe seemed cold and indifferent. Marquez looked out over the camp, seeing the faces of the Anorans as they settled into their new life. There was still work to do, still challenges to face, but for the first time in a long while, she felt a deep sense of satisfaction. Humanity had done what they had promised. They had given the Anorans not just a place to stay, but a future. And as she looked up at the stars above Vera, she knew that this was just the beginning of a new chapter. A chapter of hope, survival, and the promise of a brighter future. Humanity had shown the universe that even when every other civilization turned away, they would always choose to save those in need.